Cool. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so I think like what's really interesting with like what you shared was this idea of, like what is journalism, or like is the future of local news maybe broadening out that definition of journalism and who is a journalist, right? Because if we're going to be building trust with the community, if we're going to be out in the community more, I would say that tonight is an act of journalism, right? Sharing and creating information, right? But maybe it doesn't fit what we typically always think about that, right? So let's maybe think about a future where journalism or local news is maybe a little bit broader than it has been in the past. Thank you. Last back table.
You can skip us. We just talk amongst ourselves and didn't follow
It's all right. That's all right. I appreciate that honesty. Honestly though, like sometimes like some of the best things that have ever come out of events like this have nothing to do with local news. It's also just like the connections that you make with people and listening to them, right? So like we need to also hold that too. Yes, like we want to have a conversation about local news, but really what this is about is all of us being able to connect and talk about our community. So appreciate your honesty on that. All right, let's go to this table where Nancy is.
Okay, so most of our conversation was around citizen-produced journalism, I would say, and seeing in the future that plays much bigger roles. We all learned, well, some of us learned a new word or term. We were talking about citizen SMEs, subject matter experts. That was Greg's contribution. Well, he contributed a lot. We learned about SMEs. I just think it's a fun word. We should try saying it. And the idea that people come with a lot of base knowledge, and how can we collect that, and what can we do to kind of systemize and collect that, so it can be organized. We also talked about the role of curation, that you also need somebody who can go through all these things and kind of figure out what's what makes sense and what's left out and what you still need. So kind of systems for doing that curation, human curation, I think is kind of what we had in mind, right? Not robot curation. We also talked about the importance of transparency and disclosure. Folks were talking about how they'd really like to know if someone writing about an issue or talking or telling a story has an opinion about it or a personal experience. The example was given, if you're talking about cancer, then you should say, if you had cancer or your grandmother had cancer, and have that relate. Or say if you're writing about an issue on the ballot, maybe say how you can vote. That's pretty much not traditional journalism, but that's kind of what we were talking about. And I don't know, did I leave anything out? That was pretty good. Okay. SMEs.
Yeah, new acronym. Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, so like I think what's really interesting is that, you have different folks at different tables having different discussions, but there's a lot of themes, right? It's this idea of like, we know that if we're building a future for local news, that may look very different than how it looks right now, right? And we kind of need to be innovative and thinking, how can people contribute more? How can we bring in more perspectives? How can we be out in the community more? So it's really interesting kind of seeing how all these things are really connected. Also appreciate what you said about transparency, which our back table was practicing before by sharing with us that it didn't follow the prompt that I worked really hard on drafting. Okay, thank you. Middle table here.
So our conversation was more about like the flow of what has been happening and how it looks like. And looking back, looking into the future, we talked about reinventing the door policy beyond the jargon, but how does that really look like? And civic engagement, not only for money, but how does the people look like, not in, beyond the jargon, with cultural competency and other aspects of that. And then we sort of moved towards the need to embrace diversity and inclusivity, but in a way that moves away from the extracted narrative of the media, but making those stories alive, not just as a show, but as an actual experience of the community, and then putting back resources in the community. So it's a relationship story that moves away from just showing something. And that also helps us learn from our mistakes, from not addressing diversity in the past, and avoid mistakes that we've done in the past as well. So it's bringing the community into the table, sharing their stories and having that relationship building and reinventing that open door policy. And also, we need to start talking about equity in media access, but also in media distribution. Including resources not only in mainstream media, but there are even smaller newspapers or newsletters in the community that should have some resources as well. Not posting in those outlets as well affect certain communities that we don't address normally. And the most interesting thing we talked about was educating in media consumption. So having an outlet, having a way where we can educate folks on how to actually consume the product that's being created, and moving away from the media and marketing and investing more in investigative journalism. So tapping into schools and educating folks on how to consume that media, but also move the market away from from the marketing and just having more quality content. So both ends.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. I love that you brought conversation around equity into the room. Thank you for sharing that. We'll go with this table over here.
All right, good evening, everyone. We spoke about journalists being approachable, yet remaining skeptical about the stories, so not necessarily being spoon-fed, not my words, but spoon-fed content, but following up and being willing to investigate and remain skeptical about those leads. The table also felt like they had a duty, journalists have a duty to check in with government and check government, and make sure that truly what is going on remains transparent and is clear to everyone, and it's translated in certain ways in certain communities and others, so everybody can understand, everybody can engage and also be involved. We kind of talked about perhaps the future is maybe citizen journalists, but we're kind of torn on that. Maybe it's also paid journalists. Wouldn't it be great maybe if it was more paid journalists, but if it is citizen journalists, is there a need for training so that we can all agree what the rules are? So there's not one person like Gordon's deciding, hey, he's going to use this other set of rules and I'm going to use a different set of rules. My facts might be a little bit more gray than and then along with that, is there an editor? Who is the overall editor for this? Is there an editor for this? And how does that go about? How do you do the process for that? And then also, I think the other thing too is that while we're talking about investigation and in-depth reporting, but is there a need for ephemera? Is there a need for entertainment? Is there a need for lively stories and positive news? And so we also talked about that too, in this kind of perfect reality. And then also, I kind of mentioned strong editing, so I won't again, but that's pretty much in a nutshell, unless anybody else has any thoughts. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. Go to this table right here.
We were kind of on the same track as a lot of the tables have been, but I think what we talked about that no one else has talked about yet is whether or not journalism would help residents learn from neighboring communities so that they can build their community better, and whether also media could be a way to build community. One of our commenters lives in Longmont, and he said that he feels like even when he goes to these community festivals, that it's not really, there's not a whole lot of community there. He still feels like he's an outsider, and even sometimes at like the HOA or neighborhood level, there's still not that sense of community. So can journalism be something that helps lessons or telling stories so that everyone gets to know one another? So that's kind of like our hope for what journalism might look like in 5 years. We were also discussing the idea of whether citizen journalism is a way to get more stories told, but then we were also wondering what's the training? How do we make sure everyone's following the same ethical standards so that the facts that are being presented are not just people going off on Facebook, as we're calling, and what that might look like. We also talked about where up. But more, very clearly, there needs to be more voices in journalism, and it's not clear how we find that. We didn't quite get to nailing that down, but there does need to be more voices in journalism. And be ready for the next thing, I guess. Cool.
Cool, thank you. I'm really I'm enjoying how like a lot of folks are kind of talking about like what's the community's role in whatever this new future is. Is it going to events? Is it sharing their perspectives more? Is it actually media making? And so I think like the reason why that keeps popping up is because we know that newsrooms capacity is lower than it used to be. There's just as many stories, right? Maybe we're not going to be able to hire back all the reporters that we used to have. So what's the role of the community then to actually build up some of that newsroom's capacity that was lost, right? That's kind of the thing that I'm hearing. How we do it, we can obviously discuss, but I think it's interesting that that's kind of been a constant throughout. Go with this middle table here.
Okay, we also didn't follow the rules.
It's all right.
Our conversation started with a question as to whether our corporate ownership had any influence over our local coverage.
Mm-hmm.
The answer is no, by the way. And since we're sitting with two newspaper readers here, they just mostly wanted to engage us in conversation, which we were happy to do.
Good.
I can share more of that privately, I guess, if you want, but we have no notice.
It's all good. It's all good. It's all right. It's all right.
We had a very enjoyable and informative conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, again, this is really just about us having a conversation. Like, it's not often that folks from the community can sit down with someone who's representing a local newspaper. Not like this necessarily, not where there's a quote that's needed or information for a story where you're just having a conversation. It does happen, but we need it to happen more. So I'm glad that you were able to do that there. That's good. Cool. We'll go right here.
Our table was a little different because we have somebody who's already running a news site in Boulder, so none of you have come on. Somebody who wants to start up a news site in Greeley, and then these three who want to start up a news site in Lyons. And we talked about kind of the similarities and differences. Kelly here in Greeley, her plan is to pay people. Yay!
Yeah.
Working stiff journalists. Yeah, that one's Greeley. Working stiff journalists. The Lyons project is going to replace something that was there, a weekly newspaper that had short pieces, and there is a monthly newspaper, but it's longer and not quite so timely. So they've already done a survey and know that there's a need for weekly, timely, short news, and it's all volunteer run, as the previous newspaper was, and we have somebody who studied journalism in school at Mizzou, so he's got the chops, and he's already volunteered to run the whole damn thing. With help. But it's all, we talked about kind of the synergy of volunteers and the role that people would play in it. And then the Boulder one, you know, we talked also about, you know, with content aimed at Spanish-speaking readers, audiences, interpreting, right, translating. So what's the cost? Can you find volunteers that would do that for the public good? And so we had this very interesting conversation about the reality of publishing content onto websites, and then we kind of also discussed a little bit of what about a print edition, maybe a monthly compilation print edition. There's a nice library in Lyons. Would the library be a good source to help print, or certainly for having people who want to read the news but don't want to look at it on their phone? Can they go to the library if they don't have a computer at home, and have the library help them access this news site? Do you guys have names for yours? Too early? For names?
Lyons Reporter.
Lyons Reporter.
Reborn.
Oh, it's the same thing, because the old one was that. So there's an interesting conversation about towns that in Lyon's case, they lost a source and they're reviving it. And in the Greeley's case, the Greeley Tribune does a good job, but like a lot of newspapers, much smaller today than it used to be. So there's space to do different kinds of more investigative, ProPublica style stories and do a good job of that kind of journalism. And you specialize in Boulder in legal stories, right? City government stories, sorry. So that's something that maybe isn't covered as well with the daily paper. And although the student paper at CU, they're on it. So yeah, it was interesting to be talking about sites or news sources that are already existing and will be existing in the future.
Great. Thank you. Very cool. Good to hear some new things sprouting up. It's great. We got the last two tables here.
So our table started our discussion about how do we consume news now, and a lot of people spoke about how they digest a lot of national news, but not so much local news, because they don't feel like it's quite available. Either their paywalls or subscriptions are too expensive, or they just can't find it. They don't know about it. They haven't sought it out, or so many reasons. So we can talk about what is that solution? How do you do that? And also the other thing was, in the newspaper, there's kind of an internal debate between, I need to finish reading everything in it because I feel like I paid for it, I need to know everything, and also like the environmental impact of having a physical newspaper. I want to read everything, but then what do I do with it afterwards? And do I feel, does that upset me and then I have to recycle it? And things like that. So we talked about what is the solution, and some of that was using newsrooms to make sure that they push their content. But then there's this fine line of, I'm in front of a screen all day, things push at me all the time. How do I get good news and push at me but not be overwhelmed by it? And then what are the ways that we look at media? And some of us were very visual people. Some of us could listen to a podcast. Some of us like to read it. And then what levels do we want that? Like how in depth do we want that to go? And so maybe utilizing, seeing the future, thinking about those different ways of how we digest our media, how we digest our news, and giving us kind of a sampling of all of that. And then we talked about kind of what should be in that news, and we talked about how community members need to be more represented, so the equality concept again, but it not being the news of the reporter, it being the news of the person whose story it is. So it's my story, I'm the one telling that story, not necessarily the reporter. So how does that come across? And how do we utilize media today to do that? And then, just other ways of looking at news and where it comes from, and like following up on meetings and being more connected as a community, because we felt like social media disconnects us, but how do we bring ourselves back together? Those are the ideas.
Great, thank you. Last but not least.
At this table, we had a really nice conversation. We introduced ourselves, and that also gave us the space to begin talking about, particularly we focused on the relationship between the community and journalists, and also some of the roles, and we got to a little bit about the resources part. But in general, we spoke about how there is not just one community, but that there are several communities, and that's okay. We also spoke about these differences and even language differences and how there has been barriers for these groups that have been minoritized and that we are called minorities, that there's been sort of this barrier to have access and to be also seen and coveraged in a dignified way. And so that took us to speaking about the need for accountability, responsibility, and not falling into stereotypes and tropes that are very common in journalism, and sort of that gives way for this mistrust as well. And we also related it to maybe there's sort of like a mainstream and national coverage, and that's sort of what differentiates the local coverage. And we also spoke about how local media needs to have this openness and just to have open doors for these different communities. We also talked about some different examples of sort of welcoming spaces. For example, comment lines and outreach activities as well. Let's see what else. And then we spoke about and sort of how we can use also the different technologies that are available, even social media, and how sort of thinking creatively of how these different technologies can help also to reach people, tell different stories. And then we also got to the point where we're talking about community journalists and community journalism. How can we have professionalism with a volunteer base? And so probably that touches upon some of the issues raised around maybe training and sort of ethical guidelines and all these kinds of things. And then related to the resources part, we were talking about different experiences in media projects that we are involved in, and we were talking about sort of what we have done to fund our projects, and so either seeking grants and or having the basically volunteer base, like KGNU has a lot of its either members or its people supporting our radio station. And so we also spoke about the need and sort of the role of transparency as well. Not necessarily how that other table talked about it, but in terms of being transparent of what your principles are and what you are for. But it's also hard because we can say, we have certain principles and that we are acting a certain way, but maybe the general public or other publics don't see it that way. So we didn't come to a consensus around that, but transparency was also an issue here.
Cool, thank you. One thing I just want to say, which I think is something that we should really hold on to, is that the conversation that we had tonight could have only happened with the people who are in this room tonight. So I want to give everyone a round of applause. Give yourself a round of applause for coming to this conversation. And really what tonight was about was this kind of first step to, a collective vision for local news. And so, the conversation will not end here tonight. And I want y'all to continue to be talking about this. And I'm going to hand it off to Melissa, who's going to just talk a little bit about next steps and wrap up for us. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, just to reiterate, basically what Mike just said was just that, the whole purpose of tonight was to bring media makers and kind of those we think of in the traditional media closer to the community that is being served. And I think you heard, I heard again and again in so many people's future vision that connection just gets closer and closer. So that was a really exciting theme for the night, and I hope you all stay engaged. This, the Colorado Media Project, like I said, I'm local, I live here in Longmont, I'll see you, at King Super and whatnot, but The media project, this is just kind of the beginning. Longmont is kind of always on the edge in the forefront. You guys are, we're innovators here. And this is the first kind of conversation like this that we're hosting, but we're hoping to do this in more places and more communities and kind of learn more about what other communities have in common and what we're hearing around the state about the future of local news. So be on the lookout for that. And in Longmont in particular, I mean, I think that there are, like we've heard, there are some great community groups, there's some great business, media businesses that are learning here and want to be engaged with you. So keep in touch with them, and we will be back as well. So the other thing I'm being asked to say is don't forget to fill out the survey. It will really help us improve future events and the rest and whatever comes next here in Longmont. So fill out the survey. I know that there are some specific things. Macy, I know, mentioned that they're having some community meetings about the future of the media maker space. So that's a real tangible kind of thing that can continue some of these conversations. And then also, you know, put your ideas on the wall, because we are capturing this and we want to kind of go back and crunch all this information and kind of report it back to you so that you can kind of keep your finger on the pulse there. So thank you for coming. Drive safely on your way home. And really, this is the beginning of a great conversation. So thank you all for being here.